Hello, and welcome to Ars Biblica, the Art of the Bible. I'm your host, Steve Finley, and together with Pastor Jeffrey Ernessy of Houston Second Christian Church, we've been talking about poetry in the Bible. An interesting conversation, Jeffrey.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm having a good time with it. How about you?
Terrific.
So, last time we were together, we talked about the idea of personification.
That's right, personification.
As one of the items in our toolbox for understanding poetry. That sometimes the poet will take a concept, an idea, or maybe something from the natural world, and act as though it were a person.
Right.
So
allowing an exploration of the complexity of emotion and intent that those things on their face may not have.
Exactly. So I wanted to talk about a different but related concept today.
Okay.
In the Bible and also in other poetry that we might term the mythologizing impulse.
Okay.
So, and you know how this can be, where the poet will, in the context of a poem, take something from mythology or folklore that is not real within the realm of the story, or perhaps is real within the realm of the story, but isn't real in the primary world, so to speak.
Right.
And will, in an elaborate way, quite often for satirical purposes, in fact, will elaborate on this image of this folkloric or mythological idea.
Right.
So the Bible is full of this sort of thing, and it's a poetic technique.
And because the Bible is so full of these things, those things have now migrated deeply into the culture and the Western canon of literature and everything else we've been talking about.
Yes. And although the Bible is not alone in doing this, in the ancient world, it was a sort of a thing that you might do if you were a poet. You might pull in a folkloric or a mythological element for the purpose of expounding.
Well, and many of those mythological stories, and here I'm thinking about the Greek myths, many of those stories are in their own sense poetic.
Yes. So the writers of the Bible have a rich, sort of a secondary shelf of mythological or folkloric elements that they can bring in for the purpose of creating this kind of poetic motif. I'm thinking particularly about the story of the great dragon, the Leviathan, as we sometimes term it. So there was some folklore about this. You read in Genesis at the very beginning, in that wonderful prose poem at the very first of Genesis, the creation story, right? That when God is creating the sea and the sea creatures that live in it, God said, let the waters swarm, and with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created, and the English Standard Version that I'm reading from translates it, God created the great sea creatures. The Hebrew says God created the tannin, dragon. So then you have, for instance, in the book of Job, you have the extended Leviathan poem toward the end of the book of Job, where God has appeared in a whirlwind.
And Job is a fascinating book because not only is it a philosophical treatise, but it's written as a play.
It is. It's dramatic. It was meant, at the very least, to be publicly declaimed, so to speak.
And we've said earlier in these conversations that that's common among all of the poetic writings of the Bible, is that they're in some sense almost meant to be performance.
Oh, absolutely. But in particular with Job, you would have readers who would take on the various parts in the book of Job and read them as though they were conversing with one another.
Dialogue.
It is. And now, I wouldn't say necessarily that it would be performed on a stage with like
No,
special
no,
effects.
no.
I'm not sure you would have the budget for the special effects you would need for God appearing in a whirlwind.
Right.
Although, that was a very common thing in ancient Greek tragedy. Was at the end of the story, what would you have?
Deus ex machina.
You would have the God out of the machine. Well, this seems to be something very similar. God shows up at the end of the story in a whirlwind, because you can't, depict Yahweh, but you can picture the whirlwind that he appears in. And God takes Job to task, and by extension, his three friends, for expecting an explanation. Job has been, if you'll remember, he's having the worst day that it was possible for someone to have.
Indeed.
And he insists that it's not because he's done anything wrong, but he wants God to explain. And God shows up, and what God basically says is, if you don't even understand the natural world, how can I explain to you the supernatural world? And there is, in the context of that, this extended poem, which again, it's very long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But it begins, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook? And it's satire. And it's meant to be funny. One of the things that a lot of people are very surprised by when they first start to read the book of Job is how funny it is.
And knowing the kind of Jewish comedic idioms,
Yes.
it doesn't surprise me at all that Job would. I mean, how else do you face the kind of tragedies that Job endures,
Except with comedy.
except with a sense of humor?
So you have God show up. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord, basically putting a bit in his mouth? Could you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaws with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? And on it goes, right? Behold, the hope of man is false. He is laid low, even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. And the idea is like, this is Leviathan. God made Leviathan. And so if you're going to come at God and ask for an explanation, well, you better be prepared, because he's the Leviathan maker. But it's comedic. And we spend so much time, and so many people get sort of bent up. What is Leviathan? What is Leviathan? Well, nothing in the natural world. There are a lot of things in the natural world that are like Leviathan, a whale, a crocodile, a giant squid. All of those things are good candidates for something Leviathan-like. And you can even imagine dinosaurs, right, whatever. But nothing is Leviathan. Leviathan is this story, this idea that's out there in the Hebraic folklorosphere, so to speak, for writers to grab a hold of. And so then in the Psalms, you get Leviathan, the dragon, used in almost like a political cartoon.
Well, and that's a motif that runs through the entire book.
Yes.
I mean, by the time you get to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation,
You get the sea monster, the dragon out of the water.
That's exactly right.
But because of the whole story of God having this great big fight with the Leviathan and killing it, you get Leviathan used in a political cartoon way in the Old Testament for Egypt because of the parting of the Red Sea. And so the parting of the Red Sea is depicted as a sort of Leviathan fight. And Egypt then is this sea monster. And so then you get, for instance, Ezekiel talking about the Rahab, the Egypt monster that lives among the reeds like a giant crocodile. But it's very fat, and for all that we might be tempted to rely on it politically, it actually doesn't do anything. In fact, the King James says, "And I will call you Rahab that sitteth still."
That does nothing.
That does nothing. Exactly. But then, yes, as you get to the end of the book in Revelation, you get the monster from the sea.
Well, it's so full of poetic images. I'm just imagining what heavy metal music would have been like without the four horsemen.
Oh,
I mean, that's a poetic image that the Bible creates, and boy, that image has fascinated generations of people.
So there's always this mythologizing tendency, this tendency to grab a hold of something out of folklore, out of myth, in order to put it in the poem for the purpose of creating this image. And oftentimes it's a mocking image. You get it in Romeo and Juliet again, with the Queen Mab speech.
Mercutio's speech it's amazing, and Queen Mab herself is a personification.
Well, she's a fairy,
right?
And so there's all of that extensive fairy lore. But in the context of the story, does Mercutio believe in Queen Mab?
Probably not. Oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She's the fairies' midwife, and she comes in a shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn by a team of little atomies over men's noses as they lie asleep. And he goes on for, 2 pages about this
about Queen Mab, the fairies' midwife,
the fictional character.
But in the context of the play, he's using that folkloric image to mock Romeo.
Right.
And so, in a different play, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where fairies are real, Queen Mab could be a character.
Yes.
But in the context of Romeo and Juliet, that's a naturalistic play with not a lot of folkloric elements happening in it. It becomes this image to use in a poem. Well, in the same way, in the book of Job, for all that there are supernatural elements, there's the Satan, there's God, that there's also this sort of undercurrent of folklore that God in the play reaches for as a way of saying, you might want to rethink your arrogance that causes you to think you know what you're talking about.
And I think it's incredibly fascinating that the Bible not only reaches out and mythologizes, but is itself been mythologized in unbelievable ways.
Oh, it's kind of interesting that the Bible itself then becomes this second shelf toolkit that writers reach for.
Right.
When they want an image.
And Shakespeare, of course, his knowledge of Scripture is a little uncanny at times.
Well, he was living at a time when there was a revolution in biblical availability.
That's right.
That's part of what's going on there, that all of a sudden, in a way that it hadn't been before, the Bible was available in English wildly, and you could access it. The goal originally when they started translating the Bible into English was every plowboy in England will know more about the Bible than the bishops do.
Right.
And so Shakespeare had access to a translation of the Bible in English that then made it extremely easy when he wanted a biblical allusion for him to reach for it and to put it into the text.
And that was the Geneva Bible.
The Geneva Bible,
right.
Yes. One of the predecessors of the King James Version. In fact, the King James Bible was authorized by the king in part to supersede in popularity the Geneva Bible. That was the goal. Geneva Bible was a little too hot in its translation.
Right.
It did things like it translated the word for king as tyrant, and King James did not like that.
Right.
And so the King James translation was like, let's cool it with that a little bit. It's a little too Puritan, not Church of England enough.
And this brings up an interesting interesting tangent to this conversation, and that is that if you believe that God created us and the universe, then you have to believe he's at least somewhat directing the hands and quills of these writers.
Yes. And all the way from, and we don't even always reckon with how complicated that process is. So you take a book like Psalms or a book like Job, and behind the Job story, the question is always, was there an actual Job? I'm perfectly willing to believe there was a guy named Job.
Absolutely.
And that there were his 3 friends and that he went through what he went through. What I don't believe is that he and his 3 friends had their conversation in elaborate Hebrew poetic dialogue.
Right.
There's a writer who sat down and worked through,
adapted Job's story.
Well, in the same way that when Shakespeare writes one of the Henry plays, is it true to the historical events? But did they say those things?
Right.
They didn't. They weren't talking in court.
I mean, you can go all the way back to Medea and Agamemnon, and those.
Right. Were they having conversations like that? Yes. Were they having them in poetry? No.
Right.
And in the same way, were Job and his friends having these kinds of conversations? Sure. Had lots of people had these kinds of conversations? Sure. Were they having them in elaborate Hebrew poetry? No, because that's not how people who are in pain talk.
Right.
But we put it on the stage, we put it in public declamation, and people are like, oh, it's so real. That really touches me right where I live. Because it's poetry, because it's heightened language, because it's well thought out.
Right.
And well said. And so then you get something like the Psalms. The writers of the Psalms didn't know that they were writing the Bible. Right. They didn't know that it was, when the writer of Psalm 1 sat down, he didn't write Psalm 1, verse 1.
Right.
He didn't know it was going to be something that we were still reading thousands of years later.
And this is another thing that we've bumped into on our travels together. People are sometimes shocked, just like this passage that we're talking about from Job. People are shocked at how funny the Bible can be. We tend to want to take it so seriously because it's the Bible, but the truth is that humor is a great way, just as in this passage you were reading. Humor's a great way to get a point across.
Well, in particular, because you're right, one of the poetic devices that is a device of humor that the Jewish literature is full of is hyperbole.
Right.
Well, we were looking at it just now. Will you take him with a fish hook?
Right.
Will you
put him on a leash for your girls to walk?
Right. It's hyperbole, and Jesus did that. When Jesus says the thing about why do you look at the speck that's in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own eye?
Right.
No one, picture someone with a log in their eye.
Right.
And it's funny.
It's ridiculous.
Right? Someone's got a log coming out of their eye, and they're going to come over with this log and try to help you take the speck out of your eye. You're going to be like, no.
Right.
Because it's Jesus, and we're reverent about Jesus, because it's the Bible, and we're reverent about the Bible, we don't recognize the comedy.
Right. And once again, I know I've mentioned this before, but when I think about the history of the Yiddish theater and playwrights like Neil Simon, the most prolific and successful American playwright in history, and his sense of humor, and Woody Allen's sense of humor, there's something about that Yiddish
even
theater.
Mel Brooks.
I mean, those guys are hysterical. And not cheap gags, but really interesting, funny takes on the world. And I just think that character is woven through the Bible. The more we study it, the more I get a chuckle out of some of the things that are in there.
There's so much comedy in the text of Scripture, and
sometimes I think people's enjoyment, one of the things that happened to me as a young man when I encountered the work of Shakespeare is I became fascinated with it. I became very, very interested in it. And behind every rock that I looked, there was a new treat. And the Bible is like that. Mm-hmm. Everywhere you turn over a stone, interesting bugs crawl up. And that's, I guess, why we've been having these conversations for nigh on to 30 years.
Well, you see just the idiosyncratic nature of the text. I say it all the time. Just read the thing. It's astonishing what's in there because it's so odd and so it very much itself. Even little things. Like you read Philippians, for instance. Philippians is not a poetic book, but it's a well-crafted piece of rhetoric. But at the same time, you're very aware of the fact, if you're reading it right, that Paul is writing to people he knew and knew well. And one of the things that he's writing about is the struggle that they're having there in Philippi that he puts down to they've lost their unity. And the reason that they've lost their unity is that they've lost their humility. And the reason that they've lost their humility is they've lost their joy. And so he's about joy.
No, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because that's a nuclear bomb of an idea.
It is, yeah. It's huge.
So you go back through it step by step.
So they've lost their unity.
They're
disunited.
Okay. Well, I'm you know what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of our
country, yes. But the reason they've lost their unity is that they've lost their humility, right? And it's a circle, right? Because why have they lost their joy? Well, they've lost their joy because they've lost their unity. Why have they lost their unity? Because they've lost their humility. Why have they lost their humility? Because they've lost their joy. Why have they lost their joy? Because they've lost their unity. And it's this circle, right? And so he targets joy. Joy is mentioned in one way or another, I think about 16 times in just that little Philippian letter that's 4 chapters long. And one of the digs that he gets in is he keeps telling them to rejoice. And the second time he's told them to rejoice, it's like he can hear someone in the audience saying, "You already said that, Paul." And he says, "Well, it doesn't hurt me any to say it again."
Bears repeating.
Right. And it's safe for you to hear it. And then at the end, as he's closing out the book, he says to them, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again. Rejoice." And see, and now it's funny.
Yeah.
Because you're reading it through the lens of the whole book as he's moving through it, hearing because it's a group of people he loves and he knows well, and so he can get in some digs on them like that.
It was an incredible discovery for me. The first day I read something in the Bible and laughed out loud. And it's happened.
Yeah. And there's something just in the gospel, in the writings of Luke and Acts, there's something funny on almost every page. But you just have to have the...
I love the great story, and once again, we're kind of going far afield from our poetic discussion, but I love that story about Christ who had gone up on the mountain to pray and comes back, and all of his guys are arguing. Mm-hmm. And he just stands there. I laughed at that. I thought, he comes down, and there's supposed to be his team of spiritual leaders that are going to convert the world to this fledgling faith, and they're bickering like a bunch of... I just think that's hysterical.
Well,
it's a funny image, and once again, I chalk that up in some sense to that Jewish character.
Well, it's good rhetoric, and that's the thing, is that we talk about the Bible as 1/3 of it is poetry. But the whole thing is art.
Correct.
And anytime you're approaching the Bible, if you don't approach it as art first, you're doing it wrong, I would argue. That's my position on the text, and I'll die on that hill.
So like if you just consider it to be the scripture and reverent, and you don't realize that it has been, as you said in an earlier episode, the careful creativity of it.
Someone has labored over this material. Someone has worked hard to shape it and to craft it. And if you don't come to the text and appreciate the shaping, the craft of the text, and even in the most prosaic of texts, even if it's just the Gospel of Mark, which, people look at Mark and it seems very primitive. The language is primitive, short, punchy sentences, but it's very well crafted. We could talk sometime when we have some real time about the craft that Mark puts into the text, the shape that he uses rhetorically.
And that's a hallmark of all poetic literature. Nothing is random, always crafted, always meant to point to a purpose, always meant to get your imagination and your emotions fired in a certain way so that you have buy-in. And these are not ideas. This is not like a TV guide version of life.
No.
This is like deeper than the Brothers Karamazov.
This is what do you do when life gets real.
That's right. That's right. And I love the fact that one of the many ideas that's embedded in that is when life gets tough, poetry is worth your time.
And when life gets tough, you have to laugh.
Having a sense of humor. Gosh, I love that somehow in that poem about Leviathan, we've been told that, laugh at yourself a little bit. Because it's coming one way or the other.
Laugh at yourself a lot, because you're probably faintly ridiculous most of the time.
Well, that's a great place to kind of wrap it up. Thanks so much, Jeffrey, for the time you're spending with us. And thank you for joining us here at Ars Biblica, the art of the Bible. We wish you knowledge and blessings for all your days.